Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be putting Gardevoir EX in the spotlight as a potential contender for the 2023 World Championships in Yokohama. This archetype is touted as one of the strongest in format. It's gained a ton from the Paldea Evolved expansion. It did very well at the NAIC, although it was taken down in top 4 in both occasions. But people are expecting this to be the front runner going into the World Championships. So let's first look at the general strategy of the deck. And the archetype really does revolve around your psychic energy, trying to cycle through the deck as much as possible, using your refinements, using your Radiant Greninja, using your Shining Arcana to amass large hand sizes, have good control over the game, making sure that you can play key supporters as and when you want them. But all the while, you are discarding a good amount of your psychic energy because the Gardevoir EX's Psychic Embrace allows us to utilize those energy in the discard pile. We can throw them all onto a couple of key attackers. Itself can be used at times as it does have pretty decent high hit points and hits for 190, which is enough to deal with single prize Pokemon quite well as being sometimes a threat at 2-hit KOing in the opening stages, especially if your EX can tank against certain matchups. This is a valid strategy, but we try and work in higher damage output Brainwaves from the single prize Shining Arcana Gardevoir, as well as that Storm Slash from Zacian V, where even though you're putting a ton of damage on your Pokemon, they're the ones getting the instant knockouts on possibly even high hit point EX Pokemon and VMAX Pokemon with enough Psychic filtered throughout the deck. So that is the main concept here. Because we are quite a setup based deck as well, we're going to take a couple turns evolving into our Pokemon, cycling through that deck. So naturally Iono is going to be our best friend here, as we're usually going down 1 or 2 prize cards before we start initiating the race on our own end, unless we do power spike some early rare candies and have pretty decent starts, which means that we're going to be the ones in control of Iono, one of the biggest supporter cards in the game for controlling a game state when you're trying to take big knockouts whilst also putting your opponent down to a lower hand size. That's a big reason why Gardevoir EX is just so successful, because it has so much of its own onboard draw power through Refinement and Shining Arcana and your Greninja that you can recover from opposing Ionos and your own Ionos, even in the mid-game, whereas your opponent may be a little bit less stable, a little bit less able to have that bounce back, because we're going to be constantly hand disrupting and knocking out key threats. So that's always a thing to bear in mind, that we just naturally do well in a format where Iono is a crucial supporter card in a number of decks. Let's have a look at a skeleton list for Gardevoir then. As we know, we want a very thick line of the Gardevoir, and we're going to have a split of the Arcana and the EX. Both are definitely mandatory in the deck list. Having that Brainwave as a single prize attacking option is very useful with turn attachments, with high rolling Psychic Energy off the top 2 from Shining Arcana, and also just doing prep Moonglow Reverse from Cresselia and putting energies banked onto Curliers and Gardevoir. You're actually able to use this Brainwave to knock out even V-Star Pokemon quite easily. So we can be up trading with our single prize Pokemon, definitely something to bear in mind. Also using Boss's Orders with Brainwave to knock out evolving 2 prize Pokemon is very helpful for you. And then we just have essentially some Pokemon to help things get going. The Greninja and the Mew help us cycle through the deck, and also, especially Mysterious Tail, great at grabbing VIP Pass in the opening stages, great at grabbing those rods and level balls on turn 2, even things like Rare Candy for power spikes. This is a very helpful card. The Cresselia with that Moonglow Reverse is very helpful against the Lost Zone box players, but as I said, it can also be used to prep damage on certain Pokemon and set up your Brainwaves for future turns, so it's just an all-round very solid basic attacking Pokemon. We have the Manaphy to protect our lower hit point Rolts and Curliers in the opening stages from opposing Radiant Greninjas attacking into us, which is really important. The item cards are basically all just search, because we are all about getting into the game. We have Super Rods for some Pokemon recovery. We have, at the moment, just 2 research, 2 Boss's Orders, and 3 Iono. Typically, we will be padding out the support accounts in one direction or another, so I'll get onto that in a moment. But just know that Iono is definitely a crucial supporter in the deck, and it's something we will be trying to use over and over again as we get to the nitty-gritty in that end game scenario. For stadiums, you're obviously going to want to have a couple in here at least because of your own Psychic Embrace ability. You never want this to get shut off by Path to the Peak. So Collapse Stadium is a great way that we can remove some heavily damaged Pokemon from our board, or there are times where we can use Psychic Embrace a bunch, then collapse away our own Gardevoir EX so we can represent only single prize board states towards the later stages of the game. And also the Artisan Stadium is going to be a one-off in here just for an additional search option for our Manaphy, as well as all of our decent basics, the Mew and the Ralts, etc., which is going to be really important for us. And Psychic Energy is going to be, like I said, such a big, important factor of the deck. 10 is kind of that minimum count that we're looking for in the deck list. Let's have a quick talk about matchups now. And this is actually quite a deceiving one. This is going to be the Trainer Hill data from the 17th of June up to the 17th of July, the day of recording for me. And it looks quite sparse, quite barren, quite unappealing for Gardevoir, but you have to remember that the lens of a best deck in format is always going to look like this in terms of your matchups, because the format is essentially warping around Gardevoir being so popular, so powerful, that naturally people are teching or choosing decks that are naturally good against Gardevoir, because that's the only way they survive in the metagame, because otherwise Gardevoir will just trounce other things around it. So that's why you're not seeing many natural favourables, just Miraidon, which is already on the fringes, and Ting-Lu, which also isn't all that popular. But we do have the vast majority of the metagame in that even category. And I think even though these archetypes are sometimes even trying to tech quite heavily against Gardevoir, things like United Wings, things like Charizard Lost Zone Box, you would think these decks are really solid into Gardevoir, but just the fact that you have Iono Disruption, the fact that you have so much better draw power than some of these archetypes, they're only even matchups, which means that Gardevoir is still free to do quite well, even though there is quite a volatile field where everyone is expecting to come up against Gardevoir once or twice in a tournament. That doesn't necessarily mean they're always going to have a good time into you. So that's something to bear in mind, where we have an okay time into a lot of these archetypes. The only truly unfavourables, by the looks of things, are going to be some Lost Zone engines. That's going to be the Giratina Lost Zone, as well as the Gudra Lost Zone decks, the sort of dragon multi-prizes. And then we have, at the very low end, the single prize / turbo Lost Zone box, where it is a sub 40% win rate from the data that I was looking at. Now, you can all take this with a pinch of salt, and I think in general, Gardevoir is a difficult deck to play, and we've seen that you can have ridiculous records with Gardevoir with the right pilots, and I think that's a big deal when you are looking at this general data set, not to be too put off an archetype, especially as strong as Gardevoir, because you will gain natural percentage points yourself as you become more proficient with Gardevoir. You're going to make less mistakes, you're going to give less openings to some of these archetypes, and you're going to have a better time yourself into these matchups. These are things to bear in mind, as it looks like there's only one truly bad matchup right now, which is going to be the sort of turbo Lost Box variants, I would say. Onto the tech options now. There are quite a lot, and the first one is to note that there is currently no V-Star power being utilised in the deck, so there is either the Forest Seal Stone option or the Sky Seal Stone option. The Sky Seal Stone was utilised at the EUIC, but it's kind of been phased out as of late, but I do think it might have a decent time in this metagame, and specifically for the World Championships, I'm thinking about day one, where tying is so painful that accelerating the amount of turns required to win the game as Gardevoir by taking an extra prize card on a V-Star or V-Max Pokemon, of which there are tons in format right now. There's a lot of powerful Arceus decks. There's the V-Max that's sort of come back into the equation from Inteleon Urshifu. There's Mew, of course. There's Lugia. There's a ton of V-Star and V-Max Pokemon around right now that having to take one less knockout by using a Sky Seal Stone with your Zacian can be so powerful. I think this has mostly fallen out of favour because A, it's not a consistency card, but B, we've sort of got away from the 2 Zacian count for the most part and are just playing one copy, and when you're constantly Ionoing your opponent and getting hit back by Iono, sometimes it's hard to piece together the Sky Seal plus Zacian combo. But if we can make that come together, it's going to be a very powerful option that, again, reduces the amount of turns you need to win games, and I think in a 50-minute best of 3 that could be very, very viable. Forest Seal Stone is kind of that safer choice where you can stick it on a Luminion V, you can stick it on a Zacian V, and just flip that V-Star marker early to try and get, you know, a Candy, to try and get a VIP pass in those opening stages just to get going in the game. It's just a really nice sort of catch-all card. You're quite happy naturally putting Zacian down in the opening stages just to start using its own ability to filter Psychic Energy out the deck as well, have that Roar of the Sword option, and then you become an early attacking threat. So the Forest Seal Stone is kind of that catch-all where possibly you're playing low counts of certain cards, but this just gives you that extra out to find them and have some more difficult plays to pull off come together thanks to this extra out in your deck. And I think next up we're going to really talk about the divide between these Gardevoir players' builds right now, and it's really a divide between Palpad plus multiple supporters that you can see on the top line here, where there's the option for Worker for some stadium bounce, as well as Penny being a means of picking up some damaged Pokemon like Zacian against Lost Zone players, or even just picking up things that would otherwise get trapped by mean looks from Umbreon or from Mawile. And then having the Luminion in here to sort of help cherry pick these single copy supporters as and when you need them, plus adding to your overall just outs of getting into the game, because of course Luminion isn't just a +1 out towards a supporter, you also have the 3 Ultra Ball rattling around your deck as well, so just adding 1 Luminion gives you really a big jump in percentage points as to hitting a supporter turn 1 or turn 2 if you've gone first. So this is a really helpful card just to make sure you're playing the game, and Palpad gives you that coverage from, you know, Professor's research and stuff, so that you aren't worrying about having to get rid of resources. You can recycle them, and recycle the Worker specifically or the Penny specifically in the matchups where they're required can also be a really big deal for you. So these are all things to bear in mind. So there's that sort of camp of Gardevoir players, but then we have a secondary camp which is just playing more good supporters and just a higher count of stadiums. And that's where you'll start to see, alongside the Collapse Stadium and the Artisan, sometimes you'll see Temple of Sinnoh in here to be quite disruptive against specifically Lugia players, so you can shut off Gift Energy, and also the Single Strike Energy force them to have a bounce. And again, because we are playing defensively so often with Iono, making people have multiple combinations all on a single turn whilst they're getting hand disruptive isn't always that easy, so that's always a big card for you. Then there's also Champions Festival. This is another way that you can help your Shining Arcana Gardevoir push into one-hit KOs onto V-Star Pokemon. You naturally can put 6 energy onto a Gardevoir, then turn attach. That gets you to only 270 damage. But if you have a Champions Festival, you're then able to ability on an extra Psychic Energy to push you into 300 damage. So I do think Champions Festival has some real upsides if you are expecting a heavy Champs Festival based metagame and you want to have a third stadium coming into the deck list. It's something I've tried over and over again. I've never found it to be bad in the list at all, but it's not really ever caught on in the general population. Then Lost Vacuum is also something worth debating. This is a tutorable via Mew way of bouncing a stadium, but also has other upsides because we have started to see some tech tools going into certain deck lists. We've seen certainly Arceus players trying to have Box of Disaster or even Panic Mask, so having a Vacuum in the deck would naturally give you coverage to those tech options from opponents, whilst also adding to your overall stadium counts, and one that is, in fairness, slightly more searchable than physical copies of stadiums, because again, you have that Mew naturally in your deck list. Reversal Energy is often seen as a one-of in these Gardevoir builds because it gives you some great bounce-back potential. It allows you to keep fully healthy in certain instances. If you're knocking out opposing single prize Pokemon, just attaching a Reversal Energy keeps you out of range of Cramorant and out of range of Sableye, which can be quite important for the Lost Zone matchups. But also this again allows you to uptrade with your Brainwave Gardevoir with the attachment of Reversal Energy plus a ton of abilities coming onto your Gardevoir at once. You can be scaling up even into the max knockout range on a single prize Pokemon, which is an exceptional uptrade, but requires you to be behind on prize cards. Finally, just a few other things to note. The Spiritomb is somewhat of a tech card for the fusion-based builds of Mew in particular, but also can come in handy a little bit here and there against the likes of Lugia, and even a little bit against Chen Pao decks as well, because they are both quite reliant on Luminion to get their setups going. So these are nice things to shut off in certain occasions. And then there's the question mark of Hisuian Heavy Ball and possibly even Mirage Step Curlier. I'm almost at the point at thinking that Mirage Step Curlier is basically a tech card against Lost City-based decks, like, again, Fusion Mew and possibly even the Arc Duraludon Umbreon style archetype, because using Mirage Step and then having excess Rolts within your deck that you can then candy into Gardevoirs means that even if some of your pieces are getting Lost City'd as you go, you still should have enough physical Ralts and Curliers between you alongside your rare candies to actually maintain a decent amount of Gardevoir presence throughout the game and make sure you're continuing to draw cards and continuing to represent Brainwave attacks when need be, as well as your Gardevoir. So that's something to bear in mind. And Heavy Ball, kind of that similar thing where sometimes you just feel far worse off as a deck if you've prized 1 or 2 Ralts, certainly. If you don't have access to your Greninja, if you don't have access to Manaphy in a number of matchups, if you don't have access to Cresselia or Zacian, all of these one-of Pokemon, especially as basics, are really, really integral to specific matchups. Having your higher damage output from Zacian, having your higher like healing options from Cresselia, having just more draw power from more Ralts or more Greninja accessible. These are all really important cards to cherry pick, and having that Heavy Ball in the opening stages of the game can be massive for you. And I think specifically because, again, we have that Celebrations Mew, you actually have a good chance to find the Heavy Ball, even with like an opening search in the first couple turns, because you have so much dig specifically for item cards. And that would give you access to the Heavy Ball, which then unlocks some of these Pokemon that can find their way into the prizes and could be awkward for you. So it's definitely a card that I'm considering quite a lot. On to a few deck lists then. The first one I'm going to show off is this sort of Penny plus Palpad option with a Luminion plus Forest Seal Stone, trying to wrap things up together. Again, we're still leaning into the classics of having the thick Gardevoir presence. We have all those one-off Pokemon in here. And the Forest Seal Stone is trying to be that halfway house between playing, you know, that extra rare candy, giving you access to reversal energy when you need it, giving you access to some of these key supporter cards like Worker and such when required. It can be something that allows you to sit on board as well and protect against opposing hand disruption in the later game as well. You know, you can allow your opponent possibly to gust up your 2 prize Pokemon that has the Seal Stone attached to it, but then they're not dealing with Curliers, they're not dealing with Gardevoirs or your Gardevoir EX, and importantly, they're also not hand disrupting you in most instances, so the Forest Seal Stone can sort of sit on board and still be just a presence that can help you close out games, or it can be instantly flipped just to give you essentially a 5th copy of Battle VIP Pass. If you have access to Fog Crystal or Ultra Ball, you can get your Zacian V or your Luminion, put it down, instantly Forest Seal Stone, get that access to extra basics and just get into the game. That is often something that you will see with this list. If you see that forest, it's being used early just to develop your board, because you know that as a setup deck, as Gardevoir, you just want to get cycling cards as quickly as possible. That's where the deck becomes extremely dangerous. You can amass hand sizes easily over 10 cards if you're just given the chance to get into the game, get multiple basics developed, and then start evolving up from that basis. So the Forest Hill Stone, definitely a nice sort of catch-all card that opens up a number of slots just by being a one-of in the deck. The other option is to have a sort of just good supporters approach. This is much more like Rowan's top 4 list from the NAIC, where we are just playing the high counter Iono, a couple Research, a couple Boss, and a Serena, but not playing Penny, Palpad, or Worker. Instead, we are playing 3 copies of Stadiums, and we're playing a Switch in here as well. I do think it's still important to play a card, either Penny or Switch, in your deck, so you are protecting yourself a little bit against Mean Look, because it is definitely a backdoor strategy that some players will use against you to try and steal wins against you. So that's something to bear in mind. The Switch, I think, is still a core card in the deck list, even if you're not playing that Penny. It is a space that unfortunately you probably do have to yield as a Gardevoir player. But the idea behind this list is, even though we don't play Luminion now, we have less physical outs to supporters in theory, but we don't have to put a 2-prize vulnerability into play, and we just have enough very good high-quality supporters that when we are finding our supporters, we have big digs into the deck. We're going instantly researching for 7. We're seeing 6 from Iono in the first couple turns. Serena's that fallback for a little bit of extra dig here and there as well to just add to your overall count. And by having the Champs Festival in here as well as your Reversal now, you have a couple means of getting one-hit KOs with your Brainwave Gardevoir, which I think is a really big deal as well, and is still being slept on. I think it's a very, very good option to have for the World Championships. Another possible option that I have discussed a little bit is going back in that sort of time capsule to the EUIC-based build, which was where we were having a heavier emphasis on Zacian and that Skyseal Stone. Having a couple copies of Zacian and then going back to playing Penny does give you some good defensive plays against Lost Zone players, where you can try and get your turn attachment plus Roar of the Sword onto your Zacian V, so that if the opponent knocks out a lower hit point single prize Pokemon that you led with, or if they play Escape Rope, you can just naturally attach and Storm Slash on turn 2 without having to sort of high roll the turn 2 rare candy to get attacking via Psychic Embrace, throwing energies across the board. So you kind of have a better defense against the Lost Zone matchup, where you have the double Zacian core, and then you have the Skyseal Stone for uptrading into the number of VMAXs that are around now, or the V-Stars that are around, so you can have easier prize maps. Think about dealing with Arc Duraludon or Arc Umbreon. You literally only need to attack 2 times to win that game, thanks to having Skyseal Stone. That's the same for all these VMAX matchups. It also allows you to play around Iono and Roxanne that little bit better, where you only take a 2-prize knockout, and then you're still just 1 attack away from winning the game, so you can just focus on filtering out the rest of the cards in your deck and just working towards this Skyseal Zacian combo. One other thing that I did want to mention here is that you could easily still play 1 Zacian in this deck list, but you probably would have to work in that Hisuian Heavy Ball to be that other copy, so you don't really gain a space by going down to 1 Zacian, but I did think it was worth mentioning because I'm still a really big fan of the Hisuian. I think it could be very solid. One thing you'll note as well is that I'm quite high on basic Psych Energy and on 4 copies of Fog Crystal, because it is so important, especially without Reversal Energy, to just see as many of these Psychics as possible, so the Storm Slashers are getting the work done on their own end and still reaching that higher damage output threshold in the opening stages. So I do think there's definite merits to going back towards Zacian, because I do think it covers a good amount of matchups, just based on the Skyseal Stone, but also the fact that Zacian is very good against possibly your worst matchup, which is going to be the Lost Zone players. Having that early attacking threat and not being reliant on Candy and just giving up a ton of tempo is massive, I think. On to the closing thoughts for Gardevoir then. It continues to be the deck to beat, and that means that every deck in format is going to have somewhat of a game plan against Gardevoir, and you could find a number of players who are specifically teching against you in the tournament, which can be worrying and troublesome. We saw it at the NEIC, where there were the Panic Masks coming out, where there were the Box of Disasters. These are specific tech cards for just one matchup, and people are still thinking that it's worthwhile because they expect enough Gardevoir in the room for it to be a valuable choice. And that will continue to be the case, as Gardevoir is still probably top dog going into the World Championships. I also think another awkward thing about playing Gardevoir is that it is a setup deck. You require a number of actions if you want to pilot this deck correctly. You need to be filtering your Psych Energy, you need to be filtering your excess VIP Pass and other cards that get diminishing returns and become useless, so you can see more cards, work towards your big combos, and that means that naturally it takes a decent number of turns to close out games as Gardevoir, and that means that ties are possibly going to be an issue for you, and we know that it's more punishing at World Championships to tie than in any other tournament. But on the plus sides for Gardevoir, it's one of the most consistent decks in format, and can use Iono better than any deck in the game. You have your inbuilt protection with a ton of draw on your own side, and you are naturally a slower archetype that oftentimes concedes a couple of prizes in the opening stages, knowing that you can make that bounce back, especially with hand disruption at your disposal. So just inherently, the way the game is played right now, with such a heavy emphasis on Iono being a late game play, having that on your side is such a powerful feeling, and one of the reasons why Gardevoir is still in the game against so many matchups. I'll also say that having a 1 prize focus for the majority of the game, yes, you sit with the Gardevoir EX on board for a number of turns, but that forces Gust plus combination cards happening all at once. There will be many turns where the opponent is forced into just taking single prize turns against you, and that's really going to help slow down that prize trade after the first couple turns and give you a leg back up in the matchup where you are taking big one-hit KOs with your higher damage output burst potential. That can come from a Zacian, or that can come from your Brainwave Gardevoir. So you sort of allow the opponent to trickle in a few prize cards in the opening stages, but then it really slows down on turns 3, 4, 5. At least that's the idea here. And again, with Iono at your side, you're not worried about then you catching up on prize cards, because you'll still end up having all of your Psych Energies in the bin for the next turn to just put back onto your next attacker and springboard another huge hit on the opponent. So those are the ups and downs of Gardevoir. I still think it is going to be the best deck in the format. I don't think it's been dethroned. It still did very, very well at the NAIC, even though it was public enemy number 1. So we have that precedent already set in stone that even though it is considered the best deck, it will not be dethroned and it will still succeed at the World Championships, is my guess. Let me know your thoughts down below. Hope you enjoyed today's spotlight, and I'll be back tomorrow for another one. Cheers.